presenter, Luis Granados, who has written a book called Damn Good Company, and today's program is related to his book, A Collection of Profiles in Courage for Humanists, a book to make humanists proud to be themselves. So, Luis, thank you. Welcome. Press it to green. It's on green.
Green. Good morning. Is it actually working? Good. Okay, that sounds good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today and giving me an opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, which is my book, Damn Good Company. It actually began life several years ago as something quite different than what it turned out to be. I started trying to write sort of a general history of organized religion and all the problems it's caused over the centuries. And as you might imagine, it was starting to get really long and really dreary. And at some point, a couple of years back, I changed my mind and said, why don't I make this upbeat instead? Make it like a profiles in courage for humanists, because there really were a few good guys who stood out during all my research. People who stood up and said, no, I don't believe what the God experts are telling me about all this supernatural stuff, and I'm not going to do what they say. I'm going to live life the way I think makes sense based on what I can see and reason. And then instead of making it sort of a sappy, oh, aren't these guys wonderful deal, I decided to spice it up a little bit by pairing each one of these heroes against a villain. Either an individual God expert or sometimes a politician who caved into the God experts of his time and place, or sometimes a class of people. I started all the way back with Socrates, who is the first one that we have very much information about, and then work forward all the way to the 21st century. Some folks you've heard of, Paine, Voltaire, some of them maybe you have not. But today I want to focus on just one of these stories. It's an interesting one to me because it's two fellows who started out very, very similar and then sort of diverged. Both of these, they were two infant boys. They were born in Southern Europe in the 1880s. One of them was born right outside Madrid, and one of them was born in the northern part of Italy. Both of them were born into Catholic families. Both of them were raised as very strict Catholics. In both cases, that didn't work. Both of them turned strongly away from religion. As young men, both of them became journalists. Both of them went on from becoming journalists into politics, and both of them were supremely successful at politics. They each achieved the pinnacle of becoming the head of state of their respective nations. But that's where the similarity ends, because there was a divergence in the way that they viewed the relationship of politics and religion that became so pronounced that these two heads of state led their nations in a bloody war against one another, which, unfortunately, the good guys lost. Manuel Azaña. How many people here have heard of Manuel Azaña? A no-hitter. Okay. He was born just outside of Madrid in 1880. He lost both of his parents at an early age, and he was sent to be educated by the monks of the famous Escorial in Madrid. He hated it because the atmosphere there was so rigorously anti-intellectual. I have dreamed of destroying all this world, he once wrote. When he became a journalist, he wrote stories as well, and he wrote one pretty well received, at least in some quarters, story about the great Spanish legend El Cid and relics, an archbishop who kept relics that were supposed to be relics of El Cid. Until one day a doctor came and looked at these bones and said, you know, I hate to tell you, but those are actually the bones of a horse. And without missing a beat, the archbishop replies, oh no, El Cid was a giant. Now, Azaña didn't hate Catholics. In fact, he married one. And each of them respected each other's views throughout all their years together. But he did find religion to be contrary to the necessary virtues of a responsible citizenry in a republic. Pure faith is unsociable, he wrote. It is not useful in the republic, whose sovereignty it neither strengthens nor defends. Our other star, Benito Mussolini, was born in equally Catholic Italy just 3 years after Azania. His mother sent him off to a Catholic boarding school in order to keep him away from the influence of his father, who was not very religious. But that didn't really work. And when Mussolini began his own career as a writer, he wrote dismissing priests as black microbes who are as fatal to mankind as tuberculosis germs. When will the day of vengeance come, he asked, when the people free themselves from tyranny and from religion, that immoral disease of the mind? In 1910, after he entered politics, Mussolini introduced a resolution urging the members of his party to avoid religious marriage and the baptism of their children. In 1920, he railed against what he called the rival Vaticans of Moscow and Rome. We are the heretics of both religions. We have torn to pieces all the revealed truths, he said. We have spat upon all the dogmas, rejected all the paradises, scoffed at all the charlatans, red, white, and black, who market miraculous drugs to give happiness to mankind. Manuel Azaña's Spain was dominated by the Catholic Church, and partly as a result of that, it was so out of step with the rest of Europe and so economically backwards that it finally lost the last of its overseas colonies to America in 1898. By 1931, everybody knew that the jig was finally up. The king abdicated, and Spain belatedly joined the rest of its neighbors in Europe in letting the people decide how they wished to be governed. And the people's choice at those first elections in 1931 was to end the tyranny of the Catholic Church. A coalition led by Manuel Azaña's party swept into power on a platform of ending subsidies for the church and breaking the church's stranglehold on education. Azaña became prime minister and one of the principal drafters of the new constitution for the brand new republic. Now, that constitution was important. It pointedly refused to state that Spain was a Catholic nation. In fact, just the opposite. It said that there would be toleration, explicitly said there will be toleration of all kinds of religious belief in Spain. Control over marriage, cemeteries, and education was transferred from the church to the civil government. Government payments to priests were cut off. You want to make somebody mad? You cut off his salary. Women were given full rights of citizenship, including the right to a divorce. What will they think of next? As Azaña famously put it on the floor of the Spanish Parliament, Spain has ceased to be Catholic. Now, this was in a country where just 5 years earlier, the government had put a woman in jail for saying publicly that she thought the Virgin Mary had more children after she had Jesus. Those days were over, at least for a while. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Benito Mussolini disdained the democratic path to power. Using the excuse of anarchy, which his own thugs helped to create, Mussolini's fascist party led a march on Rome in 1922 that frightened the king into putting Mussolini in charge. Now, despite all those earlier anti-clerical writings that I gave you a little flavor of, the Catholic Church backed Mussolini's coup. Well, why would they do that for a guy writing all that stuff? The reason they did that is because the whole idea, the central core of fascism, was unity. Every segment of society has to work together, march in the same step, in the same direction. And the church made a bet. The church gambled that once in power, Mussolini would decide that it was easier and better to try to unite the church in than to try to squeeze it out. And that was a bet that they won. They even went so far as to persuade Italy's Catholic political party to disband rather than to oppose Mussolini. And as evidence that they guessed right, one of Mussolini's first acts in power was to reinstall crucifixes in every courtroom and every classroom, and to make religious teaching in the schools compulsory. In 1926, secret negotiations started with the Vatican that resulted in a treaty, or so-called treaty, in which Italy recognized this little 109-acre garden plot of Vatican City as a so-called independent country, one of the most ridiculous ideas in the history of international relations. There was also a concordat signed with the Vatican, establishing Catholicism as the official religion of Italy and granting the church enormous power. And then there was the financial settlement, in which Mussolini agreed that the taxpayers of Italy would fork over millions of lira, equivalent to over $1 billion in today's money, to the Vatican. Why? Because 50 years earlier, when Italy had united as a country, the people in the Papal States, controlled by the Pope, had voted to join the united country. And the Pope felt bad about losing all that land and all that revenue. And in order to make it up to him, that's why they entered into this so-called financial settlement. It's exactly the same as if the Continental Congress had voted to give George III $1 billion to help get him over his loss during the Revolutionary War. Now, the Pope was pretty happy about this, as you might guess. He said that we have given back God to Italy and Italy to God. According to a shrewd German observer, a fellow named Adolf Hitler, the fact that the Curia is now making its peace with fascism shows that the Vatican trusts the new political realities far more than it did the former liberal democracy, with which it could not come to terms. Now, these so-called treaties put Catholic indoctrination back into the public schools, and it recognized the right of a Catholic bishop to remove any government-paid public school teacher at will. Priests who were accused of committing a crime could not be tried in a court. They could only be tried by their bishop. Church control over marriage replaced the civil control of marriage that had been around since 1860. Criticism of the Catholic Church was made a crime. Mussolini used tax money to pay for the salaries of the clergy and the repair of church buildings. Now, when you pay for something, you own it, right? Part of the deal was the church could not appoint a bishop anywhere in Italy without Mussolini's advance approval. A dictatorship anywhere works best when the public reveres the dictator. In Italy and around the world, the Catholic Church did everything in its considerable power to try to promote that reverence for Mussolini. The Pope called him the man sent by Providence. The Cardinal of Milan referred to him as the new Constantine. Here in America, Cardinal O'Connell of Boston exalted him as a genius in the field of government, given to Italy by God. Mussolini returned the favor, declaring in 1931 that, "I wish to see religion everywhere in the country. Let us teach the children their catechism, however young they may be." It's pretty far down the road from black microbes like tuberculosis germs. Now, the reason why Mussolini was so insistent on this lockstep unity at home was in order to strengthen Italy's hand abroad. And of course, his first major foreign adventure was the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The church could barely contain its enthusiasm. The Cardinal of Milan crowed that the Italian flag is at the moment bringing in triumph the cross of Christ in Ethiopia, opening it at the same time to our missionary propaganda. The Archbishop of Toronto said that the war in Ethiopia should be considered as a holy war, a crusade, that would open Ethiopia, a country of infidels and schismatics, to the expansion of the Catholic faith. Around the world, Catholic press and political parties vigorously supported Mussolini's crusade and denounced the League of Nations' sanctions against it. During the League's debate, the Pope himself weighed in, insisting that the hopes, the rights, and the needs of the Italian people should be satisfied, recognized, and guaranteed. The Church's support never wavered when the Italian troops started using mustard gas against the civilians, nor even when it massacred 30,000 prisoners in retaliation for a failed assassination attempt against the military governor. The world paid no heed when Ethiopia's emperor warned the the League of Nations that today it is Ethiopia's turn, tomorrow it will be you. The war and repression ultimately took over 750,000 Ethiopian lives. Back in Spain, the church did not take Manuel Azaña's victory lying down. Only 2 weeks after those 1931 elections, the Catholic primate was already condemning what he called the triumph of the enemies of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. The Catholic politician Gil Robles, after returning from the big Nazi rally at Nuremberg, proclaimed that we must reconquer Spain. We must give Spain a true unity, a new spirit, a totalitarian polity. We must found a new state, purge the fatherland of Judaizing Freemasons. What does it matter if we have to shed blood? When the time comes, either Parliament submits or we will eliminate it. A coup planned by General José Sanjurjo, to have been signaled by the assassination of Azaña, nearly succeeded. Now, politics being what it is, the liberal and secular parties, once in power, started to squabble among themselves. Can you believe that something like that actually happened? In 1933, in those elections, they were therefore defeated by a right-wing combine that was secretly subsidized by Mussolini. But this was, and one of the first things they did after they took office was to throw Azaña into jail as a political prisoner on some trumped-up charge. But this was not at all what most Spaniards wanted. In October 1935, right after he was released from jail, Azaña addressed the largest crowd that had ever assembled in Spain for any reason. All Europe today, he said, is a battlefield between democracy and its enemies, and Spain is not an exception. You must choose between democracy, with all its shortcomings, with all its faults, with all its mistakes or errors, and tyranny, with all its horrors. And when those next elections were held in February 1936, the secular side reunited and once again scored a decisive victory, despite the fact that the church circulated a catechism all over Spain telling people that it was a mortal sin to vote for any candidate who believed in freedom of religion, freedom of the press, or freedom of education. Now, after this defeat, the Catholic side, which was not dumb, decided that they had to give up on the ballot box, because left to their own devices, Spaniards would never agree to reinstall power by the Catholic Church. It was not a politician who ultimately acted. It was General Francisco Franco, the recently demoted Army Chief of Staff, who launched a rebellion in July 1936 after he had failed to incite a coup right after Azaña was reelected. Franco claimed that he was fighting against communism. It was a tough claim to make, though, because Azaña didn't include any communists at all in his cabinet. He didn't even put any socialists in his cabinet, despite the fact that both the Communist Party and the Socialist Party of Spain were important members of his coalition. Most of the army quickly joined Franco's revolt, but there was a problem. There was a big problem. The big problem was that most of the army wasn't in Spain. Most of the army was across the water in Spanish Morocco, dealing with a rebellion there that had gone on for decades and is still going on. And they couldn't get back to Spain because, for whatever reason, inter-service rivalry, I don't know, but the Spanish Navy remained loyal to the Republic. So, what to do? The solution was an airlift provided by Mussolini, who intervened on Franco's side from the very start, keeping a promise he had made to the plotters back as early as 1934. Hitler jumped in as well, with the Luftwaffe perfecting at Guernica the techniques of saturation bombing, followed by aerial machine gunning of the fleeing civilians that were to prove so effective during the blitzkriegs of World War II. Ultimately, some 100,000 Italian and German troops fought in the war, many of them not volunteers but conscripts. Now, the irony here was that in his first term of office, Azaña had been both prime minister and also assigned himself the portfolio of defense minister. And as defense minister, he devoted a lot of energy to modernizing and making more efficient Spain's armed forces, all of which was now being used against him. And with most of the army on his side, Franco could have swept right into power quickly. But that was not his intent. He sought not a coup, but a permanent revolution, in which the forces of humanism would be crippled beyond any hope of recovery. He wrote to a friendly diplomat, "I will occupy Spain town by town, village by village, railway by railway. Nothing will make me abandon this gradual program. It will bring me less glory, but greater internal peace. That being the case, this civil war could still last another year, or two, perhaps three. Dear Ambassador, I can assure you, I am not interested in territory, but in inhabitants. The reconquest of the territory is the means, the redemption of the inhabitants, the end. I cannot shorten the war by even one day. It could even be dangerous for me to reach Madrid with some stylish military operation. I will take the capital not an hour before it's necessary. First, I must have the certainty of being able to found a regime." Now, as you might imagine, the Catholic Church backed Franco's revolt with every fiber of its being. That's Franco under the canopy. For some reason, the bishop has to stay outside. The Cardinal of Toledo called the war the clash of civilization with barbarism, of the inferno against Christ. And he condemned the Jews and the Freemasons who poisoned the nation's soul with absurd doctrines, Tartar and Mongol tales dressed up as a political and social system in the dark societies controlled by the Semite International. The Pope himself denounced the Republic's truly satanic hatred of God. When the southern village of Roziana was taken by the rebels 2 weeks into the revolt, the parish priest made a speech from the balcony of the town hall. "You all no doubt believe that because I am a priest, I have come with words of forgiveness and repentance. Not at all. War against them until the last trace has been eliminated." Over the next 3 months, 60 villagers were shot. But that was not enough to satisfy the priest, who complained to Franco that the repression had been too lenient. One of Franco's colleagues, General Mola, spoke of the important role that terror must play in the campaign. "It is necessary to spread terror. We have to create the impression of mastery, eliminating, without scruples or hesitation, all those who do not think as we do. There can be no cowardice. If we vacillate one moment and fail to proceed with the greatest determination, we will not win." Which is true when you don't have the majority on your side. General Cayipo de Llano spread his own brand of terror on his infamous radio broadcasts. "Our brave legionaries have shown the red cowards what it means to be a man. And, incidentally, the wives of the Reds, too. These communist and anarchist women, after all, have made themselves fair game by their doctrine of free love. And now, they've at least made the company of real men, not milksops of militiamen. Kicking their legs about and struggling won't save them." Mussolini declared his delight that Italians should be horrifying the world by their aggressiveness for a change, instead of charming it by the guitar. Now, as wars go, the Spanish Civil War ranks pretty high on the barbarism scale. There were atrocities committed on both sides, lots of them, including on the government, on the Republic's side, lots of them. There's no way to defend that, and I'm not going to try to do that here today. But this doesn't mean that both sides were equally to blame. Most national leaders throughout history, when confronted with the kind of internal revolt that Azaña faced, would have assumed dictatorial powers until the emergency had ended. Even Abraham Lincoln did that to some extent. But dictatorship was utterly antithetical to everything Manuel Azaña stood for, and he never gave it a second thought. His insistence on not destroying his constitution in order to save it resulted in anarchy when the bulk of his army and police force deserted in the first days of the war, allowing uncontrollable vigilantes to do their worst. Now, they were not encouraged or condoned in any way by President Azaña. On the contrary, he did everything he could to try to maintain order, not only because he thought it was the right thing to do, but for the purely practical, selfish reason that he knew he needed support from the other Western democracies in order to succeed. And every time a church was burnt, every time a priest was shot, it became more and more difficult to achieve that. But maintaining control is not an easy task when you don't have an army and you don't have a police force. Most of the killings on the Republican side occurred early in the war when chaos reigned. By 1938, when control was reestablished, the level of extrajudicial violence was greatly reduced. Now, by contrast, the Catholic rebels had a conscious policy from the top down of using the war to exterminate humanism from Spain. One slogan was, when you kill a red, you'll spend a year less in purgatory. Propaganda circulated that an enormous portion of the population behind the enemy lines, behind the Republican lines, was actually Jewish. Aside from the conscious authorization for the killings, there's a simple quantity, the numbers game. Now, winners write history books, and Franco's side, after the war ended, never tired of talking about the 55,000 civilians, including 7,000 members of the clergy, that were butchered by the Republican forces. And those numbers are true and indefensible. But since the death of Franco in 1975, local historians have started exploring the previously taboo subject of the number of killings on the rebel side. And the best estimates there put the civilian body count in the 180,000 range. Many executed for crimes like owning a radio or reading the wrong newspaper. And that's just during the war. After it ended, Mussolini's henchman, Count Ciano, reported back in the summer of 1939 that over 200 executions were being carried out every day in Madrid, 150 in Barcelona and 80 in Seville. The most recent carefully compiled estimates is that there were some 150,000 executions of Azaña supporters after the war. Yet another 400,000 Franco opponents, including Manuel Azaña, were driven into exile. Unfortunately for them, when you think about it, you're in Spain, summer of 1939, you got to get out. Where are you going to go? Well, you're going to go to France. That's a great idea, until a year later, when the Nazis invade France and succeed, and all of a sudden France is not such a great place to be. Azaña was one of those who did flee to France, and he died in hiding from the Gestapo. Another 10,000 of his fellow refugees died in Nazi concentration camps. So, how did a government that clearly enjoyed majority support manage to lose a civil war? The simple reason is that it was outgunned. Franco's rebels received massive aid from Hitler and Mussolini. But the Western democracies, including this one, would not even sell weapons to the democratically elected government of Spain. Now, partly this was related to the whole Western strategy of appeasement of Hitler and Mussolini. If you just leave them alone, give them a little bit, maybe they'll go away and not bother us. But to a larger extent, it wasn't just appeasement. It was because of the political influence in the West of the Catholic Church. Throughout the world, Catholic clergy and press rallied to Mussolini's Spanish cause. German bishops issued a pastoral letter to all the parishioners in the first weeks of the war, vigorously endorsing Hitler's support for Franco. In England, the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster called the war a furious battle between Christian civilization and the most cruel paganism that ever darkened the world. Another prominent English Catholic wrote that Franco might not be a great man, as the world judges, but he is certainly something 1,000 times more important, a supremely good man, possibly a saint. In the United States, Franco's Catholic champion was Father Charles Coughlin, the powerful radio priest whose pro-fascist broadcasts would ultimately have to be silenced after Pearl Harbor. But in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt had no stomach for a fight with Father Coughlin or any other risk to his hold on the Catholic vote. Roosevelt announced what he called a moral embargo on arms sales to both sides, elevating these military rebels to the same moral plane as the democratically elected government of Spain. Harold Ickes, the great New Dealer, wrote in his diary, he, meaning Roosevelt, said frankly that to raise the embargo would mean the loss of every Catholic vote next fall. This proves up to the hilt what so many people have been saying, namely, that the Catholic minorities in Great Britain and America have been dictating the international policy with respect to Spain. As the aid from Mussolini and Hitler poured in, Spain did turn to Russia as the only country that would reliably sell it arms, strengthening the hand of the communists in the trade unions who took the lead in the militias fighting Franco. Now, Azaña was a proud member of the bourgeois class. Poor orphans didn't get to go to the Escorial. He never, ever, throughout his career, had any use for communism at all. And when he was furious when he learned that Spain's gold reserves had been shipped to Moscow as advance payment for these weapons. He called Russia the man one admits to society because it is impossible to do otherwise, but who is the friend of no one. He totally understood how demoralizing it was to increase the communist influence in the trade unions, in the ranks of the militias, how demoralizing that was for all the non-communists in his ranks who were simply fighting for freedom and toleration. Now, throughout the war, Azaña tried to sort of position himself above the fray as a national unifier who could heal the wounds if there could just be a ceasefire. Somebody who could deal with both the real communists and the unions on one side and the Catholic rebels on the other. So he spent most of his time on diplomacy rather than trying to egg on his troops to fight to the death. Because he was convinced that if there could be even just a temporary ceasefire, like even just over Christmas, the Spaniards would not want to start killing each other once again. But the problem was that Franco was convinced of exactly the same thing, and so there was no way he was going to agree to anything like that. Now, in hindsight, this strategy, this peaceful strategy of diplomacy and trying to arrange a ceasefire seems sort of Pollyannish now that we know what we know today. And both sides, after the war, scapegoated Azaña for being a coward. At least that's what they called him. But when you think about it and look at the timelines, he came within weeks of pulling it off. Because what the timelines show you is it was in the fall of 1938 that Neville Chamberlain went to Munich, brought back his famous peace in our time little piece of paper as the final act of appeasement, and the deal was, okay, Hitler, you can take the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, but that's it. You can't have anything more. You can never have anything more than that, or there's going to be a problem. That was the deal in the fall of 1938. In March of 1939, about 5 or 6 months later, the same month that Franco rolled his tanks into Madrid and ended the war, it was March of 1939 that Hitler broke the promise he made in Munich and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. And that's the point when even Chamberlain's patience snapped. That's the point where Chamberlain made his line in the sand speech in Parliament and said, that's all. You cannot have anything more, especially Poland. If you touch Poland, there's going to be another world war. And he meant it. Now, if in March of 1939, when Chamberlain finally changed his views, there had still been a Spanish Republic around to support, it would have made all the sense in the world for England and France and maybe even the United States to say, you know, maybe we should actually sell those guys a few arms that they're so anxious to pay for. And if you carry the what-ifs just a little bit further, May of 1940, when France collapses, French army had nowhere to go, so they just surrendered. We give up. If you picture a friendly Spain to the south, all sorts of things might have turned out different. Franklin Roosevelt later admitted to his cabinet that the embargo had been a bad idea. He told his Spanish ambassador, who had been pushing all along for a different policy, that we have made a mistake. You have been right all along. But it was too late. Pope Pius XII telegraphed Franco, lifting up our hearts to the Lord, we give sincere thanks with your excellency for Spain's desired Catholic victory. We express our hope that your most beloved country, with peace attained, may undertake with new vigor the ancient Christian traditions which made her great. Now those hopes were more than fulfilled. Massive state subsidies to the church were reinstated, and its status was re-elevated to 16th century glory. Insulting or ridiculing a Catholic priest or a Catholic ceremony was made a crime. Sale of contraceptives was banned. Complete church control over marriage, burial, and education was reinstated. Censorship of books, magazines, and movies was strictly enforced. Some observers said that the censorship in Spain was even tighter than it was in the Soviet Union. My favorite example, even the King James Bible was banned because it's too Protestant. Spanish troops fought alongside Nazis on the Eastern Front in World War II, and Franco made available Spanish bases for Nazi submarines to prey on Allied food shipments. In return, the Vatican pledged every Spanish priest to say a special prayer for General Franco every day. And like Mussolini, Franco was given control over the appointment of Spanish bishops. Now, today, Benito Mussolini is remembered as sort of a pompous buffoon, which some of us think is a light sentence for that big of a hypocrite who was personally responsible for 7 figures worth of deaths. The greater tragedy is that Manuel Azaña is not remembered at all. Now, forget his personal courage, his unswerving loyalty to the vision of a tolerant society that Spain finally did become after Franco's death in 1975. His leadership of one of the few, there haven't been very many, truly nonviolent democratic revolutions in our planet's history. Isn't the man who wrote, "Liberty does not make them men happy, it makes them men," worthy of being remembered for that alone? So, that's one of my chapters. There's 19 more. I certainly enjoyed, and I could go through all 19 if you want, but I certainly enjoyed researching these guys and writing about them, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about Azaña or, anybody else you see, or about my second favorite subject, which is humanist press.
So we have a microphone. I'll walk around the room and count the hands.
Well, good. Then I don't have to pick.
Hi. One of the things I've noticed when it comes to the beginnings of war and is that there's a rhetoric that occurs before a war. You know, the people start talking a certain language of war. They start creating a narrative, and the religious people have always been upfront, about, they could just basically make up and say, God said to do this. And the humanists and the secular people haven't really had a basis in morality that's definable, the same way that they can define theirs. And one of the things that occurs to me is that to prevent war and speak that, to negate that with the language of peace, that we need to have a defined narrative where we can sort of extract moral behavior from the scientific world on the basis of, human survivability and evolution, so as to stop war before it happens. That the best way to prevent a war or win a war is to never have a war in the first place, that we need a far stronger narrative, and to evangelize that narrative, if you will, to make sure that our narrative is dominant, so that when the language of war begins, we can tamp it down before it gets anywhere.
I obviously totally agree with that, and that's one of the things I like about Azania. I mean, there were people on the Republican side, especially with the communist elements in the Union, who I did not live up to that. There was violence even before the war broke out, and they wanted a violent revolution. Azania was totally opposed to that. He was constantly saying, we need to work things out. We need to talk this through. Let's just stop shooting one another. And that's why he was able to win the elections, because that's what most Spaniards wanted. And just because there's different definitions of humanism. Just because you don't believe in God doesn't necessarily make you a good person or make you a humanist or any of that. You need to have the whole package, and which I think that Azania had.
Dennis St. George. Yes, I'm wondering, I didn't hear you mention anything about actual separatist movements that exist in Spain, that have existed for a long time around various language groups such as Catalonia and the Basques and many others, and whether a lot of this struggle wasn't just over religion or secularism, but actually was between these groups, because apparently Catalonia was a huge economic power before the discovery of America, and after the discovery of America, yeah, it's good now, but it was suppressed. I was in Spain last year staying with people in Catalonia, and I heard many really horrible stories about the suppression of their language and culture by Franco. And so I think that might have been a big part of what was going on.
There was definitely a part of it, and one of the nuances is particularly the Basque territories in the northwest, the most Catholic part of Spain, and very strong on the rebel side. It is also true, though, that when you have the more humanist-oriented type of government, the one that relies on votes rather than bullets, you can work out more devolution of power, as is happening in England today with Scotland and even Wales now getting more and more local control. Franco, once he won, iron fist. You're Spaniards, that's the end of it. I'm a big soccer fan. One of my favorite stories is about a player named Johan Cruyff, who played for Barcelona back in the when did he play? I know he coached in the 90s. I guess he played in the 80s. And anyway, he was Dutch. He had nothing to do with this. But anyway, he married a Catalan woman, and they had a child. And he went to, you had to go down to register the name of the child with the local clerk. And they went in and said, okay, the child's name is Jordi, Jordi. And the clerk said, well, I'm sorry, I can't give him that name because that's a Catalan name, and we're only allowed to give Spanish names. And Johan Cruyff, who's like the biggest soccer star in Spain, says, I am Johan Cruyff. I'm the biggest star in Spain. The boy's name is Jordi. You write that down. And the clerk said, oh, okay. Boy's name is Jordi. I believe he's playing professionally today. But little thing, and that was right before Franco died. So that was an example of some of the erosion of the power before he died.
What was the Vatican and the German Catholic Church's support or lack thereof of Hitler at this time? And did it change as the war progressed?
In the beginning, it was very similar to the situation with Mussolini. The church, and particularly the fellow who later became Pius XII, was instrumental in putting Hitler in power for exactly the same reasons they were with Mussolini. They were scared of the left side. They wanted unity. They persuaded the Catholic Party of Germany to disband, just like they had in Italy. It's an overstatement, I think, to call Pius XII Hitler's Pope, as that best-selling book does. He came to despise Hitler, not so much because of the Holocaust, he didn't really care about Jews one way or the other, but more because Hitler didn't keep the promises that he made with the church. The church wanted certain institutional autonomy, for youth groups, not the only thing, but an example is the youth groups. Catholics wanted to run their own youth groups. Hitler said, no, everybody needs to be in Hitler Youth. That's what they need to do. The Hitler Youth side won that little conflict. That sort of conflict is what got the church and the German state at loggerheads. Later on, the church wasn't total supporters of the Nazi regime, but on the other hand, they didn't do nearly as much as they could have done in order to try to undermine it.
Two things. The first one is when you mentioned San Lorenzo del Escorial, it reminded me of something I read in a very good book that's called A Very Brief History of Eternity, written by Carlos Eire, who's a professor at Yale University. And he mentions that San Lorenzo del Escorial, the king that built it, he put in it the equivalent of 1 year that Spain got out of the colonies. That's when Spain had colonies all over the place. Mm-hmm. And the purpose was for it to give masses for him and his family so that they would have, going on the way to heaven, they would have to make a quick stop in purgatory. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, I wonder if you can comment a little bit about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
I didn't know that about Escorial. That's interesting. There were lots of foreign volunteers on the Republican side, including a group of Americans who called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. There were also volunteers from France, England, all over. It's a true and sad fact that having served in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was not a good thing to have done when the McCarthy era rolled in. Those people were all under extreme suspicion, lost jobs, things like that. But they were heroic. For Whom the Bell Tolls, great book, great movie about Gary Cooper portrays a member of that brigade. And yeah, those guys were true heroes.
More questions?
How would you respond to the claim that during the 20th century there were many more atrocities from non-religious leaders such as Stalin and Pol Pot, and that abuse and death is really more responsible from secular leaders and countries as opposed to religious?
I've actually written an article about that. It appeared in Secular Nation 3 or 4 years ago, and I would respond by saying it just isn't true. The Soviet Union deaths, most of them were from stupidity rather than executions. The economic system they tried to impose just didn't work, and people starved to death. The people who try to make the argument that you're putting out, they say, well, Hitler was non-religious, and therefore the whole Holocaust is on the atheist side. Well, that just, the fact there is that anti-Semitism had largely died down by the middle of the 19th century. It hadn't disappeared, but it had largely died down. It was consciously revived by the Catholic Church after 1870. A conscious, explicit PR campaign to promote anti-Semitism in order to help them get their territories in central Italy back. They associated their loss of Rome and their loss of those territories with modernism and urbanism and Jews. The fact that Jews got more rights once the Italian government took over, they said, well, that proved the Jews are behind all this. And so they went after Jews hammer and tong and created the atmosphere that was necessary in order to bring off the Holocaust. So when you add up the numbers, that claim that many people, Dinesh D'Souza, I think, principally, just doesn't add up.
Catholic. Yes, okay. Yes, I heard that the German Catholic Church celebrated Hitler's birthday all through World War II until the collapse.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they outwardly they absolutely supported, and it went the other way too. The subsidies in the height of the war, the subsidies from the German state to the Lutheran and Catholic churches were higher than they had ever been before the war. Now, if the Pope could have waved a wand and gotten rid of Hitler, he would have. But there's a tremendous amount more that he could have done that he didn't do, including things like telling the German church, don't celebrate the man's birthday. Okay? Don't go out of your way to let the German people know that we think this guy is wonderful. Just sit still. That would have been a nice start, which they didn't do. There was one bishop, a Catholic bishop, who publicly objected to there were many horrible Nazi practices, one of which was they didn't like retarded people. They corrupt the gene pool, let's kill them off. There was a bishop who stood up and in total line with Catholic theology, said, this is terrible. You can't do that. You must stop killing people just because they're not up to your mental standards. And the reaction of the German government was, they stopped, at least for a little while, and then they secretly reinstated it. But the fact that this one bishop was able to work that kind of a change gives you a little clue as to what might have happened if from the Pope down, the word was, think how they criticize abortion today, okay? All around the world, everybody down the line, and like the nuns, if you're not even, if you stay silent and are not an enthusiastic opponent of abortion, then we're going to put your order of nuns out of business. Anything even remotely like that directed against the Nazi atrocities would have had a huge effect. The other evidence of how the Nazis were attuned to public opinion, we just passed the 70th anniversary of last month, and that's the Rosenstrasse case. There's a movie about this, in fact. Under the racial laws, they were very complicated. And here's a question: what do you do when you have a Jewish husband of an Aryan woman? Do you break up the family, or what do you do? And the answer was no. You don't break up the family. There's not very many of these people. There's a couple hundred, but Jewish husbands of Aryan women, we're not going to bother them. Until early 1943, when the war starts going the wrong way. And it's got to be somebody's fault. Certainly not Hitler's fault, because he's a genius. We need to do something about these Jewish husbands of Aryan women. So one night, all over Germany, they're rounded up and taken to the police station on a street called Rosenstrasse in Berlin. And what happened next was the German wives went to the police station, said, what's going on? We thought the law says these guys are okay. Where are they? Are they alive? Blah, blah, blah. And they don't get any response, so they stay out there in the street for days on end. These women stay there in the street. One answers, wanting their husbands back. And you might think, well, that wouldn't work in Nazi Germany. They'd all be gunned down, right? Or arrested themselves or whatever. Didn't happen. Several days later, the door opens and those men walk out. They did respond to public opinion. And you think about, if the church had come down really hard and said, we notice all these millions of Jews disappearing, okay? This is not invisible. This has to stop. It would have had an effect.
Well, you had said most of what I wanted to say about the Lincoln Brigade, but I knew some of those men, as they were older, of course, by then, but they were very impressive. And they were accused of being anti-fascist, prematurely anti-fascist.
Yes, premature anti-fascist, yes. Great line.
I was brought up in Brooklyn during the 1930s, where the church was telling the parishioners to round up the Jews, particularly the children, and to kill them. Children against the church, it was. And the only way that we could walk around was in groups of 4 or 5 where we could protect each other. And that was the background I had.
Okay.
So, you know, it was a very scary thing, and we thank the government for supporting us. They sent the police out, but the church was terrible in New York at that time.
I have a question. Does your book cover anything that's going on now in the Middle East?
Certainly does. That's a great question. My book goes out of its way to offend Catholics and Jews and Mormons, and Hindus and Muslims and Lutherans and some others. And just in case I missed anybody, one of my villains in the last chapter is this guy Barack Obama. Okay, now I've offended everybody here. That's good. I think his posture on his own religious beliefs, I lay out the evidence. I think it's deceitful. I think his public policies with regard to role of religion in politics are worse than those of George W. Bush, taking us totally backwards. And in the Middle East, I think just as the West deliberately closed its eyes to fascism in the 30s, I think this administration anyway is deliberately closing its eyes to the threat of militant Islam in the Middle East. A place like Egypt, okay, there's two parts to this so-called Arab Spring. There's a radical Islam part and there's a democratic secular part. Are we taking sides there? If we are, if there's any lean at all, it's toward the Islamic side. It's because they're more moderate. It's absolutely not what we ought to be doing. We absolutely ought to be standing up and saying, no, it's the democratic people. It's the people those are our friends. And if you're not with them, you're not we're not going to kill you, but you're not our friend. We're not doing any of that, and we absolutely should be.
Right at the back.
I want to say that I think there's a tendency among many people, I think maybe a kind of misguided liberalism that says it's not our business what kind of government a nation has. Each nation can have its own form of government. And I think that's a huge mistake. Dictatorship is horrible. It's not just bad, it's really bad. They murder innocent people constantly, and we're one human family, so when a dictator murders people in this country, he's murdering our people. We're one human family. We have to think that way. And there's also something called the Community of Democracies. It's a coalition of about 100 nations. They want to make the entire world democratic. That's their goal. Democracy in all nations, and democracy at the global level. And so I think it's important to understand this, and I think it's important for humanists to become very strongly pro-democracy. We shouldn't be wishy-washy about dictatorships. Also, historically, democracies tend not to go to war with each other. The last major war between democracies was 1812, the U.S. versus Great Britain. So the dictatorship is a horrible problem in this world. Oh, and by the way, China is also an atheist country. It's a dictatorship. So I do want to say we shouldn't put it all on the religions, because both Russia and China were atheist countries.
No, I generally agree. I think we do have values, and we should support them, and we should say these guys that support democracy and freedom and tolerance are our friends, and these guys that don't support those things are not. Doesn't mean we're going to go to war with you and bomb you necessarily, but you're just not our friends, and our money, for example, is something you're not going to get. Okay? China I complained about the communists and the Spanish trade unions. China does a lot of terrible things. There's no question about that. And we have, at least with China, done more than some others to at least criticize them and say no, we don't agree with many of the things that the Chinese government is doing. And I think that same criticism ought to be leveled at some of these countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, Jerry Grass. I saw a quote from Hubert Butler yesterday, I'd never heard of before. He's a writer, maybe a novelist. And I'm not going to say the quote exactly right. I'm going to paraphrase it. But the gist of it was that in society, a small number of people, or he called them free spirits, resist tyranny, and they're able to do so until such time as the majority of people, which he described as amiable people, are somehow disabled by the ones who want to do tyranny. So it's sort of like it's a combination of the small number of people who want to resist tyranny and the rest who decide when things are happening which way to go. Is that clear what I've said? Sort of.
What I would add to it and embellish on it a little bit is that I like people quite a bit. The problem, not the source of all problems, but the source of a lot of problems is when people are guided by something other than just thinking about what's the right thing to do here. When they're guided by, God said things should be this way. You can't deal with that. I can't argue with that, and I believe that messes up a lot of things. And religion isn't the source of all problems in the universe, but it just procedurally puts things on the wrong track that helps that minority you're talking about take over from the majority who are just trying to do things that make sense.
Well, Lewis, that was probably the most informative talk I've ever heard. Thank you very much. Lunch is ready. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.